And I want to give you guys an overview on how to monitor these servers. So go ahead and click on MS1, and you can see all the various tabs and subtabs for this server. Click on the logging tab. The logging tab defines all the logging configuration options for a particular server. So on the logging tab for MS1, we can see where the log location is for its log file and various rotation and log attributes. So we can rotate this log file based on size, based on time, or don't rotate it at all. You may have an external process or service that manages log files. There's also HTTP logging. So this is the access log. So if you have a web application running on your managed server, the access log will contain all the HTTP requests. There's also data source logging, and then there's a monitoring tab. So if we click on monitoring, the monitoring tab will give us some general statistics and information about the managed server. We can see the state, when the server was started, the version of the software. This is 12.1.3.0.0. WebLogic Home, which is where the WebLogic runtime is, and the middleware home product is installed, the version of the JDK, and the operating system that we're running on. And then underneath that, you can see the various services that are running and what versions of services that are supported. Scroll back to the top. So back under monitoring, on next to the general tab is the health tab. If you click on health, you'll get an overview of the health status for various subsystems on this server. So we've got JDBC, JTA, JMS, store and forward, and the various persistent stores. These are default subsystems. These subsystems are deployed to WebLogic, but we don't have any actual data sources or JTA pools configured. And then on the performance tab, you'll get metrics about the JVM, which is very interesting. This is new for 12C, I believe. So you can get the amount of heap size, both free and current, the CPU load for that JVM, and the amount of physical memory and committed virtual memory. You can also perform a garbage collect, which is interesting. If you need to force a garbage collection, you can do that through here. An important feature is the dump thread stacks. So if you click this button, you'll get a thread dump for the WebLogic server. And if you recall, a WebLogic server is a single JVM process, a multi-threaded JVM process. And if you have deployed an application to your WebLogic managed server, it runs on one of those threads. And so if you need to perform a thread dump to do some sort of debugging, let's say you've got your application is hung and you've got a stuck thread, you can perform a thread dump, view all the threads, and trace where that blockage may be coming from. So use the breadcrumbs and go back. Let's go back to MS1 and go back to monitoring. And click on the Threads tab. And again, we can dump the thread stacks as well from the Threads tab, and the Threads tab will list each and every thread that's running within this WebLogic server and give you some information about its performance. So in this case, we have one active thread, and then the other threads are in a standby state. So you can tell which thread is doing the bulk of the work. And if you had an application that was CPU intensive or it was stuck waiting on an IO operation, you'd be able to see that here in this table. And on the control tab, we can actually perform startup and shutdown as well. There's a remote start output. This tab shows us output from the server itself. So instead of looking at a log file, I can look here. Although I don't find this very easy to use, it's much quicker to find information if you're looking at the log file. But if you don't have access to a shell and you can't look at a log file, this is one way to look at output from the server. The deployments tab shows everything, shows all the applications that are deployed to this managed server. Right now we have no applications deployed, so it's blank. And in the services tab shows all the services that are deployed to this managed server as well. So we have JDBC, JMS, work managers, and so on and so forth. Right now, we have nothing deployed to this managed server. And that will change in the next lab when we create a data source for this managed server. The debug tab allows us to enable debug settings on this server. And we can debug just about any service, subsystem, or component within WebLogic. So if you expand any one of these scopes, there's a default scope and there's a WebLogic scope. If you expand any one of these, you can see the various different debug flags for WebLogic. So I can debug load balancing, I can debug messaging, I can debug the muxer. The muxer is used to multiplex and decode, T3 over HTTP over T3 or IIOP over T3 or RMI over T3. There's a ton of different things you can debug. If we expand WebLogic and scroll down under WebLogic, you can see that there are debug flags scoped to application, for class loader, for cluster, for deploy, which is specifically for deploying applications, for JDBC, for JMS, and the list goes on and on and on. So if I wanted to debug a data source, I could come under JDBC here. I got to keep scrolling down, and I can debug SQL. I can debug RMI, RAC if we had Oracle RAC. I can debug just the connection information. I can do that by enabling this checkbox here and then clicking the enable button down here. And now what I've done is I've enabled debug. Let's scroll down. I've enabled debug for, you can see it over here, for JDBC connections. So expand connection, let's see what we get. Right, so if I check a box, everything underneath it becomes enabled. So if I had checked WebLogic up here, then every scope underneath WebLogic would have been enabled for debug. Now, debug adds a lot of overhead and a lot of log entries to your log files. So be very selective when you're enabling debug for a WebLogic server scope or resource. Only enable what you need enabled. Otherwise, you'll never be able to find what you're looking for, and your disk is going to fill up with log files. Let's go ahead and disable the debug for connections. I'm going to check the box here next to connection and click disable. Okay, and that's all I wanted to show right now for managed servers. The next lecture is going to talk about JDBC data sources. So stay tuned.